Hey, all right. So this stream will cover the American History 1 final exam review. I'm going to pull from a variety of the unit reviews that we did in class, and I go over the association chains, the three big things that your classmates thought you should remember about their unit, and I'm going to extend on what I feel would be appropriate. For the first unit with the colonies in the beginning, since it covers such a wide time period, I'm actually deciding to take three of the unit reviews that your classmates did. So this first unit review that for Unit 1, they called it the New Beginning. And that was the title they gave to Unit 1. So the first association chain I'm going to look at, let me get this straight, is I'm going to look at Columbian Exchange, mercantilism, John Locke, Enlightenment, and the Great Awakening. So the Columbian Exchange is named after Christopher Columbus, and this is the exchange of food, goods, animals, and most importantly, disease in the exchange from the New World to the Old World, or North America to Europe. The One of the most important things that was carried over from during the Columbian Exchange would be the carrying over of disease from Europe to the Americas. It's going to be disease that will be the number one killer of Native Americans. This exchange of goods and animals from the New World to the Old World will lead to an economic policy known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is, like I said, it's an economic policy, and it really covers and focuses on two things. Number one, that colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. And number two is that the mother country they're using the colonies to gain a favorable balance of trade. Otherwise, they're exporting more than they import, or they're selling more than they buy. Most of the time, when we see mercantilism, we'll see the mother country, like England, for instance, they will use the colonies to gain access to raw materials, so they can make their manufactured goods, and then they'll turn around and sell those manufactured goods back to the colonies. An example of mercantilism in practice would be the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Act said that the English colonies could only sell goods to British ports, and then it would go out to the rest of Europe. And also, there are certain products that they could only buy from England. So the next part here for the association chain, we have John Locke, and then that's associated with the Enlightenment. John Locke is an Enlightenment philosopher. John Locke believed that government gets its power from the people, otherwise known as consent of the governed, and also believes in something called natural rights, life, liberty, and property. He's part of this Enlightenment movement. The Enlightenment is like an intellectual and political movement, changing the idea as far as the relationship between government and its people. We see John Locke and the influence of Enlightenment when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal, born with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is, directly influenced by John Locke. We also see the influence of the Enlightenment when we draw up the Constitution in 1787 with the separation of powers, the system of checks and balances. That is something that would be taken from the Enlightenment philosopher of Montesquieu. And then we have with freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That would be influenced by Voltaire. And then the last one, the First Great Awakening. It's a little bit of a stretch to tie in the Enlightenment to the First Great Awakening, but these are both movements that have a tremendous amount of influence in the colonies. The First Great Awakening happens in like the 1730s and 40s, and it is a religious movement. You're trying to get people to come back to the church, so it's a religious revival. You'll see and you probably talked about this in English class as well. Certain preachers like Jonathan Edwards, for instance, uses emotion and passion to get their message across. And as a result of the First Great Awakening, you see more denominations of Christianity sprout up. The next association chain over here deals with Jamestown, indentured servants, Bacon's Rebellion, Triangle Trade, and the Stono Rebellion. Starting with Jamestown, Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. It is settled in 1607 by a joint stock company. So they were originally there to strike it rich. However, shortly into Jamestown's existence, there was this discovery of tobacco, and tobacco becomes a cash crop for Jamestown. With the growth of agriculture and tobacco, with the establishment of plantations, you need a labor force. So Jamestown first uses something called indentured servants. Indentured servants are people who get their passage to the Americas paid for in exchange for a certain amount of time that they will work for the person. What's happening here? Indentured servants is they're connected to Bacon's Rebellion. Indentured servants, after they work for their term of contract, they're able to essentially gain their freedom, start a new life. But what seems to happen here in Virginia is that the indentured servants, when they get their freedom, all the good farmland east has already been taken, so they have to move west. But who's out west in Virginia? The Native Americans, who we've talked about and we've discussed how the English and the Native Americans definitely have a lot of conflict and clashes over the use of land. So these former indentured servants, they want the government in Jamestown to help them in their struggle against Native Americans out west. Well, the government won't help them out. And so what you see happen in 1676 is Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion are a bunch of former indentured servants. They're not happy with the way the government is assisting, or the lack of assistance that the government's given them. And they turn on the government and they actually storm Jamestown and burn Jamestown. Bacon's Rebellion will eventually be put down. And what you'll see happen here is you'll see a change in the labor force after Bacon's Rebellion in the southern colonies, and no longer would indentured servants be the primary source of labor, but rather slaves. Where do these slaves come from? Well, the slaves will be brought over from Africa through the Triangle Trade Route, and more specifically through the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is that middle leg of the Triangle Trade Route that connects Africa to the Americas to Europe. Just like Bacon, the slaves, obviously they're not happy with being kidnapped and forced into forced labor, and so you'll see rebellions happening, throughout America's history. One of the first major slave rebellions happened in South Carolina in 1739. It's the Stono Rebellion. Another major slave rebellion that you might hear being discussed will be in 1831 with Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion in Virginia. Both of these rebellions are put down. And in response, whites will put into place stricter slave codes or laws restricting the lives of slaves. So that's the first part for Unit 1. The second one I have, I picked because of the second association chain. They have religious freedom, Puritans, Massachusetts Bay, Roger Williams, and Rhode Island. So there's a couple of different reasons why people are coming to the Americas. We talked about in Jamestown, they're coming for money to make it rich. But up in New England, you have the Puritans. They're coming over to the Americas for religious freedom. And they settle and start to establish a colony known as Massachusetts Bay. This is in 1620. The Pilgrims come over with the Mayflower to Plymouth, and then you'll start to see the Puritans develop Massachusetts Bay, and they'll later be joined together. Now, when we talk about religious freedom and the Puritans, that means religious freedom for them. Anybody that goes against them will face their wrath. And one example of that is Roger Williams. Roger Williams was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay for opposing Puritans. He had a little bit more to say. He had some different religious beliefs and different beliefs as far as how they should treat the Native Americans. So he was kicked out, and he created the New England colony of Rhode Island. This also had a couple couple of the big conclusions that you need to know from Unit 1. Jamestown's the first English colony or permanent English settlement. William Penn. William Penn is a great example. He supported religious freedom. William Penn is a Quaker, and he creates the middle colony of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is really a melting pot. They support true religious freedom, and they have a lot of cultural diversity as well there. And then the third one, indentured servants can eventually be free, slaves cannot. We talked about that in the last unit review the first unit review that we had. The next one that I like is the beginning of America. They have a couple things here. Is dealing with well, let me scratch that. That seems to be another unit. Let's go next to the Revolutionary War. I like the second association chain here with the Revolutionary War and the buildup of it. It starts with the French and Indian War, then it goes to the Declaration of Independence, to George Washington, to the Articles of Confederation, then to Shays' Rebellion. So the French and Indian War, if you recall, it starts in 1754 and goes through 1763. And it's a war between the French and the Native Americans versus the British and their colonies. It's over that land known as the Ohio River Valley. Great Britain will win this war in 1763. They will kick the French out of pretty much off the North American continent. They've established sole control, really, of the North American continent. Spain still has a presence there, but not a very large one. A couple things to remember about the French and Indian War. As a result of this, this is the end of the period of salutary neglect. The British are going to start to force the colonists to pay taxes and to pay off the debt that was accrued from the war. King George III will pass things called the Proclamation of 1763, for example, banning the colonies from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And from 1763 to 1776, you start to see all those acts that we've talked about. The Stamp Act, for instance, the first direct tax on the colonies for purposes of gaining money. See things like the Boston Massacre in 1770. You see things like the Boston Tea Party in 1773. You see things like the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts in 1774. This is when the British are going to close the Boston port. They're going to essentially let the military take control of Boston in response to the Boston Tea Party. And that's going to culminate in Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence. Once again, being influenced by John Locke and the Enlightenment, formally declaring their independence from Great Britain. We have the Revolutionary War. There's, I guess a couple of key things about the actual war. You have the turning point with the Battle of Saratoga, where the French are going to join our side. You have Yorktown, which essentially is the last major battle of the war. George Washington, he's going to be the general of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And then our first form of government will be known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation have some successes to them. They have some pretty big weaknesses. A couple successes or strengths of the Articles of Confederation. They did deal with the land out west, the Ohio Valley. They passed two major pieces of legislation that you might see excerpts from in your released exam. They passed the Land Ordinance of 1785. This is going to establish a system of mapping out and selling the land out west. And they passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and that will establish requirements for territories to meet before they could become states. And the important thing about the Northwest Ordinance is that the Articles of Confederation, they're establishing a precedent or a tradition that territories that the United States or territories in the United States will eventually be able to become states, and then they will have equal representation and equal rights as the original 13 states. The turning point with the Articles of Confederation happens in 1786, Shays' Rebellion. A bunch of farmers in Massachusetts get mad. They're losing their land, and they can't pay off their debts, so they're getting foreclosed on, and Shays' Rebellion happens, and it will it will spark this renewed debate that the Articles of Confederation must be revised, and that will happen with the Constitutional Convention, and we'll see the Constitution being created out of that. Let's see here, some summaries here that they have. Number one, the Revolutionary War started because the colonies didn't want to pay the taxes without representation. That's correct. Number two, the Articles of Confederation failed because it had a weak central government and was not able to collect taxes. Yeah, we talked about the Articles having too much power to the states. And number three, know the important battles of the Revolutionary War. Yes, Lexington and Concord is the first major battle. The Battle of Saratoga we talked about, and the Battle of Yorktown, which we talked about. All right, now we can get into the presidents. So let's see here, a couple things that we have. All right, so this one has the presidents, it's creation of Articles of Confederation, the Shays Rebellion, which we talked about, and the Constitutional Convention, which comes as a result of the Shays Rebellion. Washington elected, yeah, Washington is going to be the first president for our country under the system of government with the Constitution. Washington to the Whiskey Rebellion. I'm going to take a little bit of a roundabout approach here. Washington, when he's president, since he's first, he's going to establish a couple of important precedents or traditions that people will follow. Number one, Washington is going to form a cabinet. And the second one that we're going to talk about, we'll talk about a little bit later down here. But his cabinet has two crucial members included in it, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. I want to focus on Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton is charged with the task of getting the nation's economy up and running. So to do this, he comes up with a four-part economic plan. Number one is assumption that the national government will assume state debts from the Revolutionary War. Hamilton's rationale for this is that he's going to try to get people to have a vested interest in the success of the national government. The second one will be to protect American manufacturing. He proposes a tariff. The third one is a whiskey, the excise tax on whiskey, and we'll talk about the consequences of that here in just a moment. And the fourth one will be the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States is the most controversial part of Hamilton's economic plan. And this is where Thomas Jefferson comes back into the conversation. Hamilton and Jefferson have two radically different interpretations of the Constitution. Hamilton believes in something called a loose interpretation of the Constitution. This means that essentially that if it says that the federal government can't do it, if it doesn't say that the federal government can't do it, then it is implied that the federal government can. Jefferson has something called a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which means that if it doesn't say that the federal government can do this, if you cannot find that power specifically mentioned in the Constitution, then the federal government is not allowed to do it. The Bank of the United States falls into this debate. Hamilton advises Washington. Hamilton gets Washington to approve of his economic plan, and the Bank of the United States is established. Going back to the excise tax on whiskey in 1794, and you will see, or you have in your release exams, there is a timeline of events leading up to the Whiskey Rebellion. So the Whiskey Rebellion is definitely key. You will see the farmers out in western Pennsylvania, they are not happy with this tax on whiskey. This is like, something that smacks of the system of government under the British. So they protest and they refuse to pay the tax. Washington has a decision to make. Is he going to allow these farmers to resist this tax, or is he going to show the strength of the federal government and enforce the tax? And he does. Washington sends in the military into Pennsylvania and enforces the tax, and that's pretty key. So a couple things here for the second one. This goes into the second precedent that Washington is known for. Washington only serves 2 4-year terms. He's not required to only serve 2 4-year terms, but he decides to step down anyway after his second term. This is something that will be followed until FDR. And also Washington, as he leaves, gives a farewell address. In Washington's farewell address, and in 2 of the 3 release exams, you will see an excerpt from Washington's farewell address. In Washington's farewell address, you will see him warn the country of 3 things. Number 1, he warns them of permanent foreign entanglement alliances. Don't get involved in foreign alliances. Washington, throughout his time as president, wanted to stay neutral. 2, Washington warns of political parties, which will tie into the election of 1800. And number 3, he warns of sectionalism, that divide between the regions of the country, north and south. So going back to political parties, we see by the election of 1800, political parties are firmly entrenched into the American political system. You have the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and then you have the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. The election of 1800 is important because Thomas Jefferson wins, and this is the first time that political power is transferred from one party to the other. When Jefferson is president, he's known for a couple important things. Number 1 being the Louisiana Purchase. It starts when the United States wanted to be able to use the Mississippi River and the port city of New Orleans. France decides to sell us the entire Louisiana territory. Jefferson has a small moment where he has to kind of decide, is he going to go against his strict interpretation of the Constitution? Technically, it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that the president can negotiate and buy land deals from foreign countries, but he decides that in the long run it will be for the best of the country, so he sacrifices his own personal beliefs for what's good for the entire country and buys the Louisiana territory. It more than doubles the size of our country. As a result, Thomas Jefferson wants to know what we just bought, and so he sends Lewis and Clark out to explore the Louisiana Territory, to find a trail, an overland trail to the Pacific Ocean, and just to figure out what's out there. You do see this idea of doing what's good for the entire country rather than just yourself or your region. That would be an example of nationalism, which will be talked about a little bit more in the next unit or so. So some conclusions that they have for the presidents. Washington's presidency. A couple of things that they said that you need to know. As some things are a little bit before his presidency. The Anti-Federalists and Federalists are before his presidency, and so is the Constitutional Convention. But Hamilton's financial plan or economic plan we've talked about, political parties we talked about. Washington's foreign policy achievements. Jay's Treaty is Washington trying to stay neutral and trying to get the British to stop impressment. It doesn't really work. Pinckney's Treaty is a treaty with Spain, allows us to use the Mississippi River, New Orleans, Whiskey Rebellion, his farewell address. John Adams, his attempt to deal with French impressment results in the XYZ affair. He is also known for passing the Alien Sedition Acts. And then with Jefferson, we just talked about that. The War of 1812 also happens during this unit. It's known as the Second War for Independence. It's fought between the British and the United States. You need to know the cause of the war. The cause of the War of 1812 is British impressment, as well as the fact that the British were arming Native Americans. As far as some of the major turning points, you have the Battle of New Orleans. This is the last battle of the war. It actually happens after the Treaty of Ghent. I can't move my fingers. The Treaty of Ghent is signed, end of the war, so this technically happens after the war is over. But the Battle of New Orleans happens. It is a huge victory by the United States over the British. It allows Andrew Jackson to become a military hero, and you see this wave and the surge of nationalism happen as a result of the War of 1812. All right, so the next unit that we have will be on Jackson and Reform. I am going to go with this one, Democrats for Life. Remember, Jackson is a Democrat. So a couple things here with this association chain. They have the Louisiana Purchase, which we just started with. And they are a little wrong here. The Louisiana Purchase did not ban slavery, but as we start to see people move into the Louisiana territory, and they met the requirements for statehood, that issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery has to come up. In 1820, Missouri is ready to be admitted into the Union. They want to be admitted into the Union as a slave state. The problem here is that if Missouri comes in as a slave state, they will upset the balance of power between slave states and free states in the Senate. So as a result, Missouri, the Missouri Compromise will allow Missouri to come in as a slave state. Maine will come in as a free state, and the 3630 parallel deals with the rest of the Louisiana Territory. The Missouri Compromise is our first attempt to deal with the expansion of slavery. This 3630 parallel, it says that anything above that 3630 line is free from slavery, it bans slavery, and anything below that line, slavery can exist. The Missouri Compromise, you can see it as an example of nationalism. This is people, we set our differences aside and we did what was good for the country. You could also see this as an example of sectionalism. We would literally divide the country in half. We draw a line right down the middle saying this is slave and this is free. Thomas Jefferson, if you looked at one of your release exams, Thomas Jefferson talks about the Missouri Compromise, and he says that this is bad because we have the wolf by the ears, the wolf being slavery. And that this is a debate that's going to come up time and time again as we continue to expand out west. And he's right. We see that with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The second one that we have here, we have Henry Clay to the American System, to the Protective Tariff, to the Era of Good Feelings, to the Monroe Doctrine. So Henry Clay, after the War of 1812, he comes up with this American System. He's riding the surge of nationalism, and he says we need to make all the regions of the country interdependent. That means they will rely on each other. The American System, a couple of things here. The first part is a protective tariff. You will protect American manufacturing by that's up in New England by putting a tax on imports. That will allow them to sell their goods to the west and to the south, hopefully. The second part of Henry Clay's American System is internal improvements. So roads and canals are going to be built, being able to transport goods from east to west and from west back to the east. And then finally, you have the establishment of the Second National Bank. The problem with the American System is that it does connect the North and the West, but the South gets left out. The South has turned away from industrialization during this time period, and thanks to the cotton gin, they increased their reliance on agriculture. They increased their reliance specifically on slavery. As a result of the cotton gin, the demand for slavery goes up, and the South becomes known as the Cotton Kingdom, or the King Cotton. During this time, we see something called the Era of Good Feelings. This is during James Monroe's presidency. The Era of Good Feelings is labeled this. It's a short time period, roughly, I don't know, anywhere from 4 to 8 years. It's called this because essentially there's only one political party that's in power, the Democratic Republicans. And there you have that wave of nationalism, but there are some underneath this sense of nationalism, you have some sectional issues here that are starting to come up. And a major part of James Monroe's presidency was the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine essentially says that the United States will take care of any affairs that are happening in the Western Hemisphere, and that they expect Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Essentially, the Monroe Doctrine is saying that you stay in Europe, and the United States will stay in the Americas, and we won't bother each other. Oh, and the last one that they made 3 association chains. Samuel Slater to Samuel Morse to Industrial Revolution to Robert Fulton to Erie Canal. Samuel Slater was the person responsible for bringing over the plans for the textile machines to the Americas. So he is somewhat known as like the father of Industrial Revolution. You also have, for instance, Cabot Lowell, who develops those factory systems in Massachusetts, where you're using the young single unmarried girls. Well, of course, if they're single, they're unmarried. Samuel Morse, Morse code. These are inventions that help with this period of time that we call the Industrial Revolution. We see factories start to sprout up. You also see this known as the Communication Revolution with things like the telegraph. You might see this known as the Transportation Revolution with things like Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton invents the steamboat. So now goods can be carried upstream and downstream on rivers. And you also see another example of the transportation revolution is the Erie Canal, which will connect the Great Lakes to the coast. All right, so it connects the like places like New York City to the interior of the country. All right, with reform, a couple things here. I'm not the biggest fan of this sheet with the reform. So a couple things that we need to remember with the reform movement. It starts with the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is similar to the first. It's just this movement for people, or an attempt to get people back into the church. It's religious revivals, camp meetings. The man that you need to associate with the Second Great Awakening will be Charles G. Finney. Something that's important with the Second Great Awakening is that you'll see the establishment or the creation of like these reform movements. People are taking this idea that's being talked about in the Second Great Awakening, where individuals can gain salvation. It's not necessarily predestination, and individuals have a moral obligation to improve the lives of themselves and those around them. So out of the Second Great Awakening, you see this reform movement. With the reform movements, you just need to know, for the most part, you need to know the reform movement, and if there is a person associated with that, the people that are associated with that reform movement. One of the reform movements you have is a temperance movement. This is an anti-alcohol movement. You don't really see, you have the American Temperance Union. You might see a guy named Neil Dow that's associated with the temperance movement. But typically you won't see that discussed too often. Another reform movement that you'll hear is the education reform movement with Horace Mann. This is an attempt to move towards public education. You see the prison reform with Dorothea Dix. So really trying to push for separate mental hospitals and asylums for those that are mentally ill. You see the women's rights movement come about, and with the women's rights movement, you have the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention happens in 1848. It's the first women's rights convention. They create a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, and in that Declaration of Sentiments, they model the wording after the Declaration of Independence, and they're calling for women's suffrage, or the ability for women to be able to vote. And another reform movement, and probably the most controversial reform movement, would be the abolitionist movement, or the attempt to end slavery. So a couple abolitionists that you would need to know: the Grimke sisters. The Grimke sisters are a pair of sisters that come from a southern slave-owning family, and so they use religion a lot of the times to try to appeal to people to turn away from slavery. You have William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison is a radical abolitionist. He writes an abolitionist newspaper. You might see a quote that ends with the fact that "and I will be heard," and he talks about like how in the case of slavery that you need to use strong language, and you need to get people to realize how horrible this institution is. You have Frederick Douglass, a former slave. He is first tied to William Lloyd Garrison, and then he'll break out and start his own abolitionist newspaper. But Frederick Douglass, you might see an excerpt from a speech that he gave in 1852, essentially talking about what is the Fourth of July to a slave. And in that speech, he goes through in the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution and our country in general, America supposedly espouses or supports all these great ideas of equality and freedom and so on. So, but yet you have this horrible example of hypocrisy with when you still have slavery. So, what is the Fourth of July to a slave? Going on that, the idea of slavery is in last unit: expansion and events leading up to the Civil War. So with expansion, we want to remember manifest destiny. This idea that America is destined to explore, to settle, and to conquer all territory from the east coast with the Atlantic Ocean to the west coast to the Pacific Ocean. The president that you want to associate with manifest destiny is James K. Polk. James K. Polk wins the election of 1844 on the platform of manifest destiny. And expansion. A couple of examples that we see with James K. Polk, 5440 or fight. This is in reference to the Oregon Territory. He wants the Oregon territory for the United States all the way up to the what would be the southern border of Alaska. He compromises with the British, and we see the present day border at the 49th parallel between Washington and Canada, British Columbia. We see the California Gold Rush. This comes so there's a little bit of a gap here, but they have this down here. But the California Gold Rush happens in 1849. That's why you have the group called the 49ers. These are people that settled in California as a result of the Gold Rush. And popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty will be a way to address or to reconcile the issue of, all right, we're expanding, and does this mean slavery will expand with the country? Popular sovereignty allows the people in that territory to decide. So the big jump that they had, and they brought it down here, is the Mexican-American War and what comes after that. So the Mexican-American War happens in 1846. It starts with a border dispute between Mexico and the southern border of Texas. And when the war breaks out, the very first thing, one of the very first things that happens is this congressman proposes this provision, which was known as the Wilmot Proviso, and he proposes that any territory that we get from Mexico as a result of this war, slavery will be banned. This Wilmot Proviso never passes, but it shows that people or the debates are already starting as far as expansion and the issue of slavery. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo it is a treaty that ends the Mexican-American War. We win and we gain a bunch of land from them. It's known as the Mexican Cession. We solidify our border with Texas. We get California. And out of that, you see what do we do with this territory and slavery? As a result of the Mexican-American War, we see the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 will say that California is a free state. The rest of the territory will be decided by the rest of the territory we get from Mexico, will be decided by popular sovereignty, and will put into place a stricter Fugitive Slave Act. And that's what you have down here. So they have in there something called the Free Soil Party. This is, this happens in the 1850s. You see a bunch of different political parties that are sprouting up during this time period. Of course, you have the Democrats. You had the Whig Party. The Whig Party was created as a result of an intense hatred for Andrew Jackson. You have the Republican Party. That's created during the 1850s. They oppose the expansion of slavery. You have the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party. They are anti-immigrant. And then you have the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party is against the expansion of slavery, but they're not necessarily abolitionists. They just feel like if you expand slavery into these territories, then you're hurting the ability of white males to go out and to make a living out west. So that's that is that. A couple other things here with the these posters lack that we want to talk about. Going back a little bit, you definitely need to know about Andrew Jackson. He is a hero of the War of 1812 with the Battle of New Orleans. You first see him in one of the election of 1824, which is known as the corrupt bargain election. Jackson wins the majority of the popular vote, but he does not win the majority of the electoral votes. Nobody does in that election. So if you don't win the majority of the electoral votes, or no candidate wins the majority of the electoral votes, the election gets thrown into the House of Representatives. And when this election gets thrown into the House, Jackson's opponent, John Quincy Adams, makes a deal with the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and the compromise or the deal is that if Henry Clay can deliver the votes to give John Quincy Adams the presidency, then John Quincy Adams will give Henry Clay the position of Secretary of State. When this comes out, Jackson labels this the corrupt bargain, and for the next 4 years, he cries corrupt bargain, corrupt bargain, corrupt bargain. Jackson gets elected in 1828. He gets reelected in 1832, and a couple issues here with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is he's a believer in the spoils system. Hire your friends and fire your enemies. Jackson has to deal with the Indian Removal Act, removing Native Americans from land in Georgia and pushing them out west of the Mississippi River. The Supreme Court actually decides and rules against Andrew Jackson in the Indian Removal Act in the court case Worcester versus Georgia. Jackson is quoted as saying, when he hears about this decision, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let us see him enforce it. The Supreme Court cannot enforce it, and you'll see the Trail of Tears happen. Jackson's is known for the South Carolina nullification crisis. When Jackson comes in to office, there's been a huge tariff hike, and the South labels this as the tariff of abominations. You think about like the abominable snowman. This is like a really horrible tariff for the South. Remember, they rely on a trading relationship with foreign countries. They sell cotton, and then they import manufactured goods from like places like Great Britain. So tariffs hurt the South. So the South Carolina nullification crisis comes out of this tariff of abominations, and you see South Carolina saying that essentially that they have the right to nullify or to declare, a federal law void, cancel out pretty much. They feel like if they feel like it's unconstitutional. So the South Carolina nullification crisis pits South Carolina and this idea of nullification. Can states nullify a federal law if they feel like it's unconstitutional versus Andrew Jackson? The result of the South Carolina nullification crisis is that there's a compromise tariff where they will agree over a number of years that the tariff rate will be reduced, and Jackson also gets a bill passed that will allow him, if necessary, to send the army down there to enforce this tax. Jackson also gets involved in what's called the Bank War. Jackson believes that the Bank of the United States, or the National Bank, same thing, is looking out only for politicians, foreigners, and the upper class. He doesn't believe that the National Bank has the common man's best interest. So when the recharter for the bank comes back up, Jackson vetoes it. It becomes a campaign issue. In 1832, Jackson runs in support of his veto of the Bank of the United States. Henry Clay runs banking on the fact that people support the National Bank and they will vote for him as a response to Jackson's veto. It backfires on Henry Clay. Jackson wins re-election in 1832 because obviously more people supported the bank veto. During this time, because Jackson's so polarizing, you see the Whig Party created. Fast forward to the 1850s, we call this the Decade of Crisis. It starts with the Compromise of 1850, dealing with like the divide between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. So the Compromise of 1850, we talked about that. Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, by Harry Beecher Stowe. It's a book that talks about the horrors of slavery and the institution of slavery. That's going to pull the North more on the side of being abolitionist and against slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is a piece of legislation that's passed by Stephen Douglas, or created by Stephen Douglas, and it says that when Kansas and Nebraska come into the Union to decide whether or not they are a slave state or a free state, it will be determined by popular sovereignty. Douglas thinks that one will be free, Nebraska, and Kansas will be slave. But what happens is that you have this huge pouring in of abolitionists and pro-slavery forces into Kansas, and you have what is like essentially a mini civil war, which will be known as Bleeding Kansas. That shows like how violent this disagreement over slavery has become. You have the canon of Charles Sumner in the Senate. This is in response to a speech that he gave called "Crimes Against Kansas." And for 3 days, he attacked South Carolina and the institution of slavery. And A man named Preston Brooks, who is a representative in the House, visits Charles Sumner one day in the Senate and beats him over the head and almost kills him. And it's known as the caning of Charles Sumner, or the Sumner Brooks affair, or something like that. You have the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave. He was brought into free territory by his master. He believed that since he spent a considerable amount of time in free territory, technically he should have been freed. The Supreme Court rules a couple things here. Number one, that slaves are property, not citizens. Therefore, Dred Scott should never have been able to bring this case into a court of law. Number two, the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Congress cannot make any law interfering with people's private property. Essentially, as a result of the Dred Scott decision, slavery can exist anywhere where the Missouri Compromise is labeled unconstitutional. Excuse me. Let's see, what else? You have the John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. You have the election of 1860 of Abraham Lincoln. Remember, Abraham Lincoln wants to stop the expansion of slavery. And as a result, South Carolina and the lower South secede after Lincoln's election. You go into the Civil War, 1861 through 1865. The first fighting of the Civil War happens at Fort Sumter. The first major battle of the Civil War happens at that first battle of Bull Run. Lincoln's goal in the Civil War is to preserve the Union, to keep the country together. Antietam is an important battle. It's the single bloodiest day of the Civil War, or in American history for that matter. And as a result of Antietam, Lincoln has that military victory he needs to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the slaves in the Confederacy only. What else? The Northern Plan is known as the Anaconda Plan. It's a three-part plan: capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, blockade the southern coast and not let any imports or exports out or in, and to capture the Mississippi River, which will split the Confederacy into two. The Union is able to capture the Mississippi River and control it after the Battle of Vicksburg in 1863. Gettysburg is an important battle. It's in 1863 as well. It actually ends on the same day or the day before Vicksburg. Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle in American history, and as a result, you see the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln is doubling down on his idea of like preserving the Union and what we stand for, what values and ideas that our government stands for and our country stands for. It's also the last time Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general of the Army of Northern Virginia, will invade the North. You have the 1864 election. This is between Lincoln and one of his former generals, George McClellan. Lincoln doesn't know he's going to win the election of 1864 until a man named William Tecumseh Sherman captures Atlanta. When he captures Atlanta, a couple things happen. Number one, it becomes very apparent that the Union is going to win the war, and that's going to allow Lincoln to win re-election. Then after Sherman captures Atlanta, he wants to really crush the fighting spirit of the South, and so he goes on what's called this March to the Sea, and he goes from Atlanta to Savannah. And in this March to the Sea, Sherman and his Union troops go on this path of destruction, essentially destroying anything that they come across. The Civil War ends in April of 1865 with the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Then you get into the Reconstruction, the period of time 1865 to 1867. You guys have notes on that. Just remember the Lincoln's 10% plan, Andrew Johnson and his idea of presidential Reconstruction, a little bit more lenient, versus congressional Reconstruction, and the radical Republicans wanted to punish the South. Remember that as a result of the 1866 midterm elections, the Republicans gained a veto-proof majority in Congress, and they were able to establish congressional Reconstruction. Hey. Um, what else? What else? What else? Uh, oh, um, and going through the notes, get a little bit more specific there. Just know, and remember that Reconstruction ends in 1877 with a compromise of 1877. This is a compromise of the presidential election of the previous year. The Republicans will win the presidency, and in return, the winner, Rutherford B. Hayes, now that he's president, he will be forced to or he will be agreed to remove the last of the federal troops from from the South, effectively ended in Reconstruction. Please, send me any reminders as far as any questions you might have. Um, Go on my blog, look at the release versions of the exams, ask me any questions of those, and good luck.